Before the tale begins, make sure to like the video and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're tuning in from. The last thin line of autumn sunlight slipped across the Arizona ridge, washing every rock and brittle bush in a brief gold before sinking behind the hills. Down below, the quiet little ranch waited at the foothill, its small cabin leaning from years of wind, the corral fence patched where storms had clawed at it, the water in the trough trembling from a dust-laden breeze. Inside, the fire smoldered low. Outside, Abel Harkin worked with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had lived too long without company. He braced his shoulder against the west side rail and drove it straight, his hat-brim shadowing eyes burned dark by sun and years. His sleeves were rolled, showing arms shaped by labor and solitude. As always, before night shut the land down, he scanned the ridge one more time. Old habit, old caution, making sure nothing was out of place. Something moved far off. A shape, small at first, crossed the open stretch of land. Abel didn't rush. He simply waited, hand resting lightly on the rail he'd just fixed. When the figure reached the edge of his yard, he finally lifted his chin. An Apache woman stepped into view. Dust clung to her legs. Her deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder, the stitching long given out. Her dark hair hung loose, strands stuck to her cheek, and every step looked like a battle she wasn't sure she could win. She stopped a few paces away, shoulders drawn inward, arms held close as though she needed to keep herself from falling apart. Without raising her head, she whispered, voice cracked thin from the desert. "No one wants me. I need a husband. If I don't have one tonight, I won't survive." Abel didn't answer. His jaw tightened just once, the way it did when old ghosts stirred. Wind pushed through the yard, carrying sage and cold. She touched the torn edge of her dress near her chest, steadying herself. But she didn't cry and she didn't beg. The truth was already written in her exhaustion. He studied her, not with suspicion, but with the quiet weight of a man who had learned to be careful. There was fear in her posture, but not surrender. She was worn down, not broken. Her eyes finally lifted enough for him to see the strain inside them. "I have nowhere left," she murmured. "There is nothing behind me. No one." Abel didn't step toward her. He didn't touch her. Instead, he walked past her, slow, measured steps crunching through the dust, and pushed his cabin door open. He stood aside, waiting. Her knees nearly buckled as she moved toward the doorway. She steadied herself, then paused beside him long enough to meet his gaze. She searched his face for judgment, found none. He offered the one thing he hadn't given anyone in years, shelter with no price attached. Inside, firelight pulled warm shadows along the wooden walls. She glanced at the small table, the cot near the hearth, the neat row of tools by the door. Abel stayed near the entrance, giving her space, letting her breathe without pressure. When the door closed softly behind them, she placed one trembling hand on the table to steady herself. He watched a long moment before crossing to the stove, gathering coals and laying fresh wood. When the flame caught and warmed the room, her shoulders loosened just a fraction, the first sign that fear was easing. "You can stay," he said quietly, "for tonight." She nodded, lowering her gaze, not from shame, but sheer exhaustion. The tear in her dress shifted as she wrapped her arms around herself, soaking in the slow rise of warmth. He didn't stare at the torn fabric. He didn't ask why she'd come. He simply set an extra blanket on the cot, tucking the edges so no draft could slip through. He checked the door latch, each movement calm and sure. Behind him, she watched the way he kept distance, how he kept his voice low, how he handled every fragile thing, her included, as though one wrong move might shatter it. Firelight brushed her face when she whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." Abel paused, gave a small nod, then looked out the window where night had settled over the ridge. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone inside the cabin. Later, long after midnight, the wind fell quiet. The fire burned to a dim orange glow, stretching a faint line across the floorboards. Abel sat in his chair by the window, boots planted firm, arms resting on his knees, keeping the same silent watch he always kept. Only tonight, he wasn't watching for himself. Behind him, the Apache woman slept curled near the hearth, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Exhaustion had swept her under almost instantly. Twice she shifted, small broken sounds escaping her, and each time Abel lifted his eyes, making sure her breathing stayed steady. Her long hair spilled across the blanket. The torn shoulder of her dress had slipped in her sleep, revealing bruises he hadn't seen earlier. He didn't move toward her, didn't invade her space. He just watched, quietly, like a man guarding something fragile. When dawn crept pale and cold through the shutters, Abel rose slowly so he wouldn't wake her. Abel moved toward the stove with quiet, deliberate steps, resting a hand on the kettle and feeling how cold the metal had turned overnight. Outside, the first pale streak of morning brushed the ridge and spilled across the frost-bitten yard, catching on the ice coating the trough rails. He cracked the door and stepped out for more wood. The air stung hard against his skin. He crossed the yard slowly, breath drifting white in front of him, boots crunching through the thin crust of frost that had settled after dark. At the woodpile he stopped, scanning the horizon the same way he did every morning. Nothing stirred, but the faint tracks near the far edge of his land were fresh. Fresh enough to tell him the Apache woman hadn't reached him alone. Someone had followed her part of the way. With the wood stacked in his arms, he returned inside and closed the door with a careful push so it wouldn't rattle. The sound made her shift beneath the blanket. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking through the dim cabin light, confusion flickering across her face before she remembered where she was. Her gaze rose to him, wary, watching. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she murmured, her voice raw from the cold night. "You needed rest," Abel replied, simple and steady. She eased herself upright, tugging the blanket around her shoulders and pulling it tighter across her chest, where her dress had torn open. Her fingers moved quickly, trying to cover the damage without drawing attention to it. Abel didn't glance at the exposed skin. Instead, he set the wood down and fed the fire, building it carefully. She watched him. Every small movement, the quiet care he used placing smaller pieces first, how he spoke without pressing her, how he didn't ask for answers she wasn't ready to give. Something new settled inside her. Space without suspicion. Kindness with no demand attached. When Abel looked her way again, she swallowed nervously. "You let me stay last night," she said. "Why?" He paused only a moment. "It was cold," he said. "And you were alone." She seemed to brace for more, for a condition, a price, some hidden catch. But nothing followed. The tension in her shoulders eased just a little. Then came the question she feared most. "Do you want me to leave now?" He shook his head once. "Not today." Something in her expression loosened. Not comfort, not yet, but the first flicker of relief she'd felt in days. She pulled the blanket tighter, her fingers brushing the bruised skin on her shoulder. Abel noticed the motion and finally said, "You were hurt before you got here. She lowered her gaze. Yes. By who? Her breath trembled before she forced the words out. Men who promised they'd take me in, she whispered. They didn't. Abel didn't push, but he didn't turn away either. Are they close? They were behind me in the hills yesterday, she said. I don't know how far now. That explained the tracks outside, explained the way she kept looking toward the horizon, explained the quiet fear behind her calm voice. He lifted the kettle, filled it with the last of the water, and set it near the strengthening flames. You're safe here, he said. Not loudly, not with swagger, but with quiet certainty. She studied him, searching his face as though unsure she deserved such a promise. When the kettle warmed, Abel poured water into a tin cup and set it on the table for her. Then he stepped back again, giving her room. She wrapped both hands around the cup, clinging to the heat as though it anchored her. I don't know your name, she said softly, almost embarrassed she hadn't asked before. Abel wiped his hands on his trousers. Abel Harkin, he answered. She nodded. My name is Nita. A silence followed, gentler than last night, no weight behind it. She sipped slowly, hands still trembling, and he made sure she stayed steady without staring her down. For the first time since arriving, she lifted her chin. You didn't ask why I came here, she said. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. The surprise in her expression was quiet but deep. Most men had demanded explanations immediately. Most men hadn't looked at her the way Abel did, like she was a person, not a burden. She set the cup down. I came because there was nowhere left, she said, and because the last man who said he'd take me as a wife changed his mind. He said I'd bring trouble. He left me behind. Abel didn't move for a long moment. Then he said, You won't be left behind here. Firelight brushed one side of his face, his words steady and sure. Outside, the wind scraped frost from the trough rails. Inside, the distance between them began to shrink. Not with touch, but through truth spoken plainly. And for the first morning since she fled across the desert, she wasn't afraid of what daylight would bring. The cabin settled into a cold, watchful quiet once Nita finished her warm drink. Only the fire cracked soft in the corner. Abel checked a worn saddle strap near the door, leather stretched but holding. Nita watched him with guarded curiosity, noticing the way he tested every stitch, the way he pulled each strap twice to be certain it wouldn't slip. He was a man who never left a task half done. A man who measured his steps before taking them. But she still carried questions she hadn't voiced. What he wanted from her. Whether he would truly shield her if the men behind her returned. Why he lived so far from town and everyone in it. Abel sensed those questions long before she formed them. He set the saddle aside gently and turned to her. You need food, he said. There's some dried beans and a bit of bread. She nodded and rose from the cot, the blanket around her shoulders. The torn shoulder of her dress slipped again, and she clutched the fabric tight as she moved toward the table. Abel noticed the movement and looked away out of respect, turning his stance toward the window while giving her privacy. As he studied the horizon again, Nita allowed herself to truly look around the cabin for the first time. Everything inside spoke of quiet order. Tools hung neatly on nails, jars of dried herbs and flour lined a narrow shelf. A rifle rested above the door, and blankets were folded in tidy stacks. Nothing was neglected. Nothing left to rot. This was the home of a man who repaired, tended, and kept things alive. Not a careless soul. She placed the small piece of bread on a tin plate. You live alone, she said quietly. 8 years now, Abel answered. Her brow tightened. Because of loss? For the first time since she had arrived, he hesitated. It wasn't long, but she felt it. Because people take more than they give, he said, keeping his eyes on the pale horizon. Out here, it's easier to stay by yourself. She watched his shoulders as he spoke. Broad, steady, but carrying a weight she recognized. She realized she wasn't the only one who had run from something. That calm emptiness she sensed in him wasn't born from choice. It had a history. She tore off a small piece of bread, chewing slowly. "Yesterday," she murmured, "you saw tracks outside?" He nodded. "Fresh ones." Fear flickered through her eyes, but Abel didn't let it grow. "They're not close now," he said. "No smoke, no movement, no sound. But someone followed you part of the way." Nita lowered her gaze. "He promised he would take me in," she whispered. "Promised he'd speak for me to his people. But when danger came, he left me in the dark to face it alone." "Who?" Abel asked. "His name was Sani." The name fell out of her like a stone finally dropped after being carried too long. "He told me I'd be safe, but when the council called me a burden, he walked away." Abel let the silence hold her words. He didn't prod or push. He simply gave her room. "I was cast out," she continued softly. "They said I could not bring children, so I had no worth. Sani said he would protect me, but he feared losing what little standing he had. So he left me." Her voice trembled then, not from tears, but from the memory itself. She kept her hands clenched tight on the table. "You crossed all that land alone?" Abel asked, not doubting her but trying to understand the distance she'd survived. "I walked 5 days," she said, "hiding when I could, sleeping only when the sun was high so they would not see me." He looked at her fully then. "That's why you were so worn down yesterday." She nodded. Abel stepped away from the window and moved a little closer. Not enough to threaten, just enough to show he heard every word. "Nita," he said quietly, "you're not a burden here." Her breath snagged in her chest. No one had ever told her that. Not once. Abel reached for the coat hanging on a peg and held it out to her. "You'll be warmer with this." She accepted it slowly, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. The coat nearly swallowed her small frame, but the weight and warmth steadied her shaking nerves. She held it closed, blanket still beneath it. "What will you do if those men come back?" she asked. Abel didn't hesitate. "The same thing I'd do for anyone under my roof." She studied his face. "And what is that?" "Stand between them and danger." His words weren't loud or dramatic. They were simply true. She lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by a steadiness she had never known, and whispered, "I don't understand why you're helping me." Abel leaned a hand on the table, his voice low. "Because you asked," he said, "and because you didn't lie about what you needed." Before she could reply, a faint rustle brushed through the dry brush near the fence line. Abel straightened at once. He stepped to the window, scanning the land with sharp eyes. Nita stiffened, clutching the coat tighter. Abel reached up, took the rifle above the door, and checked it calmly, with the practiced ease of a man who never wasted a movement. "Stay here," he said, not harsh but protective. She rose slowly, fear pulling tight beneath her ribs. "Is it them?" He glanced back, steady as ever. "I'll find out." He opened the door, letting cold morning air cut through the warmth of the cabin, and stepped outside into the sharp desert light. Near the hearth, Nita stood still, breath uneven, eyes fixed on the doorway. She didn't know what waited beyond those walls. But she knew this. This quiet, scarred man had already placed himself between her and the danger she feared. And no one had done that for her in a very long time. Abel walked across the frozen ground with the rifle loose in his hands, his gaze sweeping the ridge and the low brush beyond the corral. The air bit sharply, turning his breath white, but he moved without hurry. A man who lived this far out didn't ignore even the smallest sound. From the doorway, Nita watched, fingers gripping the collar of his coat close to her neck. Her heart pounded faster than she wanted it to, but she didn't call his name. She understood instinctively. Checking the land was part of who he was. Abel circled the cabin, scanning shadows and tracks. Most frost remained untouched, except near the far edge of the yard where thin mesquite bushes grew. There, the ground was disturbed, not by heavy boots belonging to the men who had chased her. The track was lighter than a man's, smaller, almost shy in the way it touched the earth. Abel knelt, brushing a fingertip along the faint imprint. When he recognized it, his shoulders eased. A young mule deer had wandered through, spooked by the cold, nothing more. He rose and turned back toward the cabin. That was when he saw Nita standing in the doorway, fear still etched into her eyes, her shoulders tight under the weight of his coat. "It's nothing," he said, walking toward her. "Just a deer. No one else." Her breath left her in a shaky exhale, her head dipping for a moment as if she needed the earth to settle under her feet again. But Abel saw more than fear of the men hunting her. He saw the fear of assuming too much, the fear of not belonging anywhere. She stepped aside to let him in. When the door closed behind them, she finally voiced the question she had carried since the night before. "Will I be allowed to stay more than one night?" He didn't respond right away. He hung his coat on its peg, checked the latch, and made sure every whisper of cold stayed outside. Only then did he turn toward her, expression straightforward. "You can stay as long as you need." Relief struck her so hard she had to grip the table for balance, though she tried not to show it. Gratitude had gotten her punished before. Too many times. She kept her chin level, quiet, trying not to reveal how deeply his words hit. Abel saw it anyway. "You're not a burden here, Nita." Her breath caught. Slowly, she lifted her gaze and met his eyes without flinching. As Abel moved toward the stove to check the kettle, she stepped closer, clutching the coat around her. "I didn't thank you properly last night," she said. "You opened your door without asking who I was, or what trouble chased me." "You were cold," he said simply. "Alone. That was enough." "For you," she whispered. "That was enough?" "For me it was." She studied him. The strong line of his jaw, the quiet steadiness in his voice, the way he carried solitude like a second skin. Earlier, she'd wondered why he lived out here without family or friend. Now she understood. This was a man carrying scars he didn't voice, scars that made silence easier than being betrayed again. She hesitated, then asked the thing any listener would want to know. "You said you've lived alone 8 years. Why?" Abel didn't stiffen, but his eyes dropped to the wood he arranged in the stove. "Some people I trusted weren't who I thought," he said. "I lost too much. Didn't see the point in letting more trouble in." "Trouble?" she echoed softly. "Like me?" He paused, not sharply, but with the weight of truth behind it. "You're not trouble," he said. "You're someone who needed help. That's different." Her throat tightened. No one from her own people had ever said anything close to that. As the stove warmed, Abel poured a little water into a tin pot to heat for porridge. Nita watched the small, steady motions of his hands, the kind of grounding task that carried two lonely people across a cold morning like a bridge. She touched the torn thread at her shoulder. "This dress, it ripped when I ran. I tried to fix it before, but I didn't have a proper needle." Abel glanced at the tear, his gaze respectful. "There's a mending kit in the drawer by your bed," he said. "You can fix it here." "Here," she repeated, surprised at the simple generosity. "You're staying," he said. "Makes sense you take care of what's yours." She nodded, absorbing the quiet reassurance under those words. She crossed to the drawer, found the small, organized sewing kit, and sat near the hearth. As she stitched, her hands trembled at first, then steadied as the familiar work grounded her. Abel watched from the corner of his eye. "You sew well," he said. "My mother taught me," she murmured. "Before she passed?" "2 winters ago." Her voice softened. "After she died, I became a burden. That's why Sani said he'd take me as a wife. But when trouble reached the tribe, he didn't want someone he had to defend." Abel set the spoon down and turned fully toward her. "Anyone who walks away when things get hard isn't someone worth following." Her eyes softened. "You don't walk away?" "No," he said. "Not from people I give shelter to." A long silence followed. Gentle, not empty. She lifted the repaired shoulder to show him. "It's not perfect." "It'll hold," he replied. A small smile touched her lips, the first real one since she arrived. Before either of them could speak again, Abel's gaze drifted to the window. His shoulders straightened, not in fear, but awareness. "What is it?" she asked. "Tracks," he said. "Old ones, but I'll need to check the ridge later." Her stomach tightened. "You think they're coming back?" "I think you ran from someone who doesn't like losing," he said. "That's enough reason for me to keep watch." She lowered her hands into her lap. "Abel, if danger comes again, I don't want to bring you harm." He walked closer, stopping a few feet from her, voice steady. "You're not causing trouble," he said. "You're giving me a reason to keep the fire warm and the door locked, that's all." Her breath steadied. Outside, the cold morning stretched across the land. Inside, for the first time, Nita felt the beginning of something she thought she'd lost forever. Belonging, however fragile. And Abel, though he didn't say it aloud, felt the cabin change. Its emptiness had shifted into something else entirely. The sun had climbed high enough to warm the frost on the ridge when Abel stepped outside again, rifle slung over his shoulder, the air cold enough to sting every breath. Nita watched through the window, fingers brushing the fresh stitches in her dress, as if reminding herself she had managed to mend something broken. Inside, the fire cracked softly, lines of light moving across the floorboards, and she stood perfectly still, waiting. Outside, Abel followed the faint tracks he'd noticed earlier, moving with the deliberate, careful rhythm of a man who had spent years reading the land like scripture. The tracks curved toward the far edge of Abel's land before fading into a patch of dry brush. He crouched beside it, brushing a low branch aside. Gone. Wind and sunlight had erased whatever story the ground once held. Nothing fresh, nothing dangerous. Still, something nagged at him. Quiet, persistent. Nita hadn't eaten properly in days. Her exhaustion wasn't just fear. Her body had been pushed past its limits long before she reached his cabin. He headed back, boots crunching through frost, turning to thaw. Inside, Nita stepped away from the window when she heard him. Not because she feared him. She just didn't want him thinking she'd been waiting on every step he took, even though she had. She straightened the blanket on the cot, needing something for her hands to do. Abel opened the door, letting the cabin's warmth wrap around him. "Tracks are old," he said. "Nothing close." She nodded, relief loosening the tight line of her shoulders. He hung the rifle above the door and looked at her more closely. "You haven't eaten right in a long time," he said. "You're too light on your feet." Her fingers curled on the table's edge. "I ate when I could," she whispered. "Sometimes I went 2 days without." He stepped closer, still keeping respectful space. "You don't ration anything here. We'll cook with what we have." She hesitated. "I don't want to use up your food." "That's not your concern," he said. "If you're staying, you eat." She blinked at the words, "if you're staying," as if staying wasn't a question anymore. Abel moved to the shelf, pulling down dried beans and a small piece of salt pork. "Sit," he said gently. "I'll make something for both of us." She watched him with cautious gratitude, then sat. "You cook?" she asked softly. "I do what needs doing." He added water to a pot, stirred the beans in, and set the lid. Slowly, the rich, earthy scent filled the cabin. Nita felt her stomach tighten painfully with hunger she tried to hide. Abel saw her glance toward the pot. Without a word, he ladled some into a bowl and set it before her. "Eat while it's hot." She took a careful spoonful, then couldn't help taking another, and another. She kept her eyes lowered, shoulders tense, expecting judgment for eating too fast. Abel didn't judge. He simply leaned against the counter, arms crossed, making sure she didn't choke. After several quiet minutes, she looked up. "You live so far from town," she said. "Why here?" He looked out the window at the open land. "Quiet," he said. "I needed quiet after things that happened." "What things?" she asked gently. He considered the question a long moment. "People I trusted betrayed me over land," he said. "Cost a man his life. Cost me the rest of mine, in a way." Nita saw the sadness in the lines near his eyes, a grief that lived deep and silent. "So you stay away from people," she murmured. "I stay away from those who take advantage," he corrected softly. "Not from everyone." She swallowed, warmth from the stew settling through her chest. "And I'm not someone who would take advantage." "No," he said simply. Her breath trembled, not with fear, but recognition. A fragile sense that maybe she was wanted here more than she allowed herself to believe. A gentle silence settled between them. When she finished eating, she asked quietly, "Abel, if those men come back, the ones who followed me, will you let me help? I don't want to hide while you face danger alone." He shook his head. "I won't put you in harm's way." "But I can watch the back window," she insisted. "I can warn you if they try to come around the cabin." Abel considered that. "I won't hand you a rifle," he said slowly. "But if it comes to it, you can keep watch. That's enough." Her shoulders eased. Being treated as capable mattered to her. She had walked days across the desert alone. She wasn't weak. Abel stepped a little closer, stopping a few feet from her. "I'll keep you safe," he said. "That's a promise." Her throat tightened. No one had given her a promise like that. Not Sani, not her tribe, no one in years. "And I'll help you," she said softly. "I can cook, I can mend, I can work, I'm trying." "I know," he said. "You already are." The room seemed smaller then, the space between them warmer than before. Abel cleared his throat and stepped back toward the stove, sensing emotion rising in her and giving her space again. She folded the blanket across her arms and watched him quietly. "You're a good man," she whispered. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened the way it did when someone brushed against an old wound he kept guarded. The fire crackled. Frost melted outside. Inside, something shifted. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, just two lives leaning toward each other for the first time, and both of them felt the same truth settle in that small cabin. She wasn't passing through. She was staying. Afternoon light stretched pale across the ridge, pushing long shadows toward the corral. Abel spent the next hour checking the fence line, clearing brush near the trough, work that steadied a man's thoughts. Every so often he glanced toward the cabin window where Nita moved quietly inside, sweeping dust from the floor or folding blankets she had used the night before. The small routines of the day belonged to both of them now, even though neither had spoken a word about it. The tracks bent toward the far edge of Abel Harkin's land, then vanished into a tangle of dry brush. He crouched, parted a thin branch, and let out a slow breath. Whatever had passed through was long gone. Wind and sun had rubbed the ground clean. Nothing fresh, nothing threatening. Yet something tugged at the back of his mind, a quiet worry he couldn't shake. Nita hadn't eaten enough in far too many days. Her weakness wasn't just fear, it was survival worn thin. Abel turned back toward the cabin, boots crunching through the thawing frost. Inside, Nita stepped away from the window the moment she heard him. Not out of fear, but because she didn't want him thinking she'd been waiting anxiously for his return. Though she had. She smoothed the blanket on the cot, her hands searching for something to do. Abel pushed the door open, letting the warmth of the fire curl around him. "Old tracks," he said. "Nothing close." Nita nodded, though her shoulders eased the way someone softens after holding too much breath. He hung the rifle back above the door and turned toward her, studying the pale look in her face. "You haven't eaten right in a long while," he said. "You're too light on your feet." Her fingers gripped the table. "I ate when I could. Sometimes 2 days passed without anything." He stepped closer, just close enough to show he meant what he said, yet far enough not to crowd her. "You don't have to ration a thing here," he told her. "We'll cook with what we've got." Her voice was almost a whisper. "I don't want to use up your food." "That's not your burden," he answered firmly. "If you're staying, you eat." That phrase, "if you're staying," caught her like a branch stopping a stumble. For the first time, staying didn't sound like a question. Abel pulled down dried beans and the last bit of salt pork. "Sit," he said quietly. "I'll make something for both of us." She watched him with a careful, almost fragile gratitude, then sat. "You cook?" she asked. "I do whatever needs doing." The scent of simmering beans slowly filled the room. Nita's stomach tightened despite her efforts to hide it. Abel noticed. Without comment, he ladled some into a small tin bowl and set it in front of her. "Eat it hot." She took cautious bites at first, then quicker ones. Her shoulders stayed rigid, as if afraid he might judge her for eating too fast. He didn't. He only leaned against the counter, arms folded, making sure she could eat without choking. After several minutes, she paused. "You live so far from town," she murmured. "Why choose this place?" He glanced out the window towards the open land. "Quiet," he said. "I needed quiet after what happened." "What happened?" she asked softly. "Folks I trusted tried taking what wasn't theirs. Land, pride. It cost a man his life. Cost me the rest of my own, in a way." The sorrow in his voice wasn't loud, just deep, buried like a stone under years of dust. So you stay away from people, she whispered. I stay away from the ones who take advantage, he corrected. Not everyone. She swallowed. Warmth spread through her chest from the stew and from something much gentler. I am not someone who would take advantage, she said. No, he answered simply. She trembled, not with fear, but with the faint shock of being seen as something other than a burden. After she finished eating, she lifted her gaze. Abel, if the men who followed me return, will you let me help? I don't want to hide while you face danger alone. He shook his head. I won't put you in harm's way. But I can watch the back window, she said quickly. I can warn you if they try to circle the cabin. He considered that carefully. I'm not handing you a rifle, he said. But keeping watch? If it comes to that, yes, you can do that. Her shoulders relaxed. It mattered that he didn't treat her like she was helpless. She had crossed a desert alone. She deserved at least that much respect. He stepped closer, only a few feet separating them. I'll keep you safe, he said. You have my word. Her throat tightened. No one had said that to her in she couldn't remember how long. And I'll help, she whispered. I can mend things, cook, work. I know, he said quietly. You're already trying. The nearness between them felt warm, unexpected, something neither had planned for. Abel cleared his throat, then stepped away, giving her space because he sensed emotion rising in her like a tide she couldn't steady. She folded the blanket in her arms and watched him with soft, uncertain eyes. You are a good man, she said. His jaw tightened, not from anger, but from the discomfort of being seen too clearly. The fire crackled. Outside, frost melted from the earth. Inside, something shifted, softly, gently, yet unmistakable. Two people who had been drifting alone for too long had begun to lean toward each other, and neither pretended otherwise. The afternoon light stretched across the land as Abel finished checking the fence line. In the window, he could see Nita moving quietly inside, sweeping the floor, folding the blankets. The rhythms of the day were becoming shared without either of them speaking it aloud. His movements stayed calm and deliberate, but Nita could read the years behind them. Years of solitude, of watching the land the way other men watched people. Do you check everything like that every night? She asked quietly. Most nights, Abel replied. A long stretch alone teaches you to be ready for whatever might come. She saw the familiar tightening at his jaw, small, almost invisible, every time he brushed against the subject of his past. Abel, she said softly, you still haven't told me what happened 8 years ago. He paused beside the table, fingertips resting on the wood as though touching something old and heavy. Some things don't fit easily into words, he murmured. But it wasn't a woman, not a broken heart, it was trust and betrayal. Nita stepped closer, the firelight warming her face. Did people hurt you, the way people hurt me? Abel lifted his eyes to hers. The answer was already there. Yeah, he said quietly. Different wounds, same result. I ended up alone. She let that truth settle, honoring the pain in it without crowding him. To give him a moment, she reached for the pot on the stove and stirred the beans she'd reheated. Do you ever wish you had someone? She asked, without looking up. He glanced toward the dark horizon through the window. Sometimes, he admitted, but I stopped expecting it. A soft breath escaped her. I didn't expect help anymore either. You got it anyway, he said simply. She sat at the table. Abel followed, taking the chair across from her, close enough to feel his steadiness, but far enough not to overwhelm her. They ate quietly, the fire popping in the background, filling the silence instead of breaking it. After a long moment, Nita spoke again, almost in a whisper. "You told me I'm part of this place now." "You are," he said. Her eyes drifted toward the door. "What if the men chasing me return? What if they try again?" Abel leaned slightly forward, his voice firm but not loud. "They're not taking you," he said. "Not from this cabin, not from this land, not while I'm standing." Her breath tightened. She didn't understand why someone she barely knew would speak with such certainty. "I don't understand why you care," she said. "Not this much." He studied her for a moment, then answered with quiet honesty. "Because you asked for help and didn't lie about what you needed. Because you walked 5 days across land that kills most men in 2. Because after everything, you're still standing. That tells me who you are." A tremor passed through her. Not fear this time, but something softer. Something she thought she'd forgotten existed. When Abel stood to wash his bowl, Nita rose as well. Their hands brushed as she reached for the pot. She froze at the warm contact. Abel didn't jerk away. He simply moved slowly, respectfully, giving her room to breathe. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said. They worked side by side after that, washing dishes, folding blankets, settling the cabin for the night. Their movements synced naturally, as if they'd been doing this for months instead of a single day. When the lantern was finally turned down, only the fire lit the room. Nita went to the cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. Abel placed another beside her without saying anything. Small gestures, strong meanings. She lingered before lying down. "Abel," she whispered, "do you truly want me here tomorrow, and the day after? Not out of pity, but because you want me to stay?" He stopped by the window, one hand on the shutter. Slowly, he turned. The fire caught the edge of his jaw, softening the lines life had carved into his face. "Yes," he said. "I want you here." Her breath shivered once. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. He nodded. A simple gesture, but solid as a vow. Then closed the shutter and settled into his chair to keep watch, as he always did. Nita lay beneath the blanket, watching the firelight move across the ceiling. For the first time since she'd begun running, she didn't fall asleep afraid. Because she wasn't running anymore. She was home. Morning arrived wrapped in a gray, heavy light that muted every ridge and stone outside. Abel woke before dawn, moving more quietly than usual so he wouldn't disturb her. Nita slept curled on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, breathing deep and steady, truly resting. He watched her for a brief moment, not with curiosity, but with a quiet sense of responsibility. She had slept without fear. That meant something. He put on his boots and stepped out, letting the door close softly. Frost coated the trough and rails, thin and brittle as glass. Abel checked the barn, the water, the ridge. No tracks, no disturbances. The quiet felt like a warning, not peace. Men who felt entitled never liked being defied. He returned just as the sky began to lighten. When he stepped inside, Nita stirred. "You're back," she murmured. "Just checking we're safe," he said, hanging his hat. She pulled the blanket aside, wrapped his coat around herself again. Seeing her in it, small, swallowed by its weight, stirred something deep in him he didn't dare name yet. "Did you sleep?" he asked. She nodded. "For the first time in many nights." "Good." They prepared a simple breakfast together. Her hands were steadier today, her steps firmer. After she filled a cup with warm water, she paused. "Abel." she said softly. Yesterday. When you said I'm part of this place now, did you mean it? Or did you say it so I wouldn't be afraid? He looked directly at her. I don't say anything I don't mean. She absorbed that with a quiet breath. When they stepped outside together after breakfast, Nita didn't hesitate at the threshold this time. Something had changed. Nita stayed close beside Abel as they walked the length of the property, wind brushing strands of her hair across her face. They climbed the small rise behind the cabin, where the desert stretched pale and endless before them. She stood still, drawing in a slow breath. When I was running, she murmured, I thought I'd die before the sun touched another ridge. Abel looked at her quietly. You didn't, he said. Because of you. He didn't answer at once. Her words settled heavy and honest in the space between them. You lived because you're strong, he said finally. All you needed was a place where you could stop running. She turned to him, her eyes steady. Do you want me here even if danger never comes back? Yes, he replied, without hesitation. Something warm flickered in her gaze, something beginning to trust its own hope again. They spent the late morning working side by side. Nita carried firewood, her steps slower than his, but steady, and Abel hammered a loose plank into place on the barn door while she held the nails ready for him. Their movements meshed naturally, like a routine they'd always shared. At midday, they rested on the porch in the worn shade. Nita tucked her legs beneath her and watched the horses grazing lazily in the yard. Abel, she said softly, you never asked why I said I needed a husband when I arrived. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She lowered her gaze, twisting the edge of his coat near her knees. In my tribe, she said, a woman cast out must find a husband or be left to the wild. No one protects her, or feeds her, or speaks for her. When Sani left me, I had nothing. No name, no place. If I didn't find someone, I wouldn't survive. Abel's jaw tightened a fraction. You're not a burden, he said, and you don't owe me a damn thing. Her breath wavered. I know that now. But when I came here, those rules were all I had left. They don't matter anymore, he said. She looked toward the ridge. What matters then? That you're here, he said. Alive, safe, not running. Warm silence stretched between them, gentle and full. As the afternoon wind rose, they stepped back inside. Abel cleaned his rifle, checking the chamber, oiling the barrel. Nita watched every motion carefully. Will they return? She asked. They might, he said, but they won't get close. She stepped nearer, bracing one hand on the table. And if they demand you give me back? Abel looked up, his voice steady. I won't. She swallowed. Even if it puts you in danger? He set the rifle aside and moved toward her. Nita, he said quietly, you came here asking for a husband because you had no other way to survive. But that's not why you're staying. You're part of this place now, and I protect what's mine. Her breath hitched, not because she felt owned, but because it was the first time she'd been spoken of as someone belonging somewhere, not as something discarded. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, tentative, testing. He didn't move away. The touch lingered, warm and real, sending a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. As evening settled, firelight cast long shadows across the cabin walls. Nita sat near the hearth, sewing a small tear in a blanket. Abel took his usual place by the window, keeping watch, but he wasn't as distant tonight. When she looked at him, he met her gaze. And when he looked back at her, her presence felt less like an intrusion, more like the beginning of something they hadn't learned to name. The danger hadn't gone. Their pasts hadn't vanished. But the fear was slowly turning into something else. Something that felt like the start of a life, forming quietly between them. The night deepened. Calm settled over the land like an old quilt. Inside, the fire popped softly. Abel sat near the window, rifle leaning beside him, though his eyes drifted to Nita more often than toward the dark ridge. She sat on the floor, sewing the hem of one of his shirts, firelight dancing across her face. The cabin felt different with her in it, not empty, not echoing, but full. She looked up now and then, studying him without trying to show it. She was learning him. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her, how his shoulders eased whenever she entered the room, how his hand hovered near the shutter out of habit, not fear. When she finished the last stitch, she rose slowly and approached him, holding the shirt in both hands. "It's mended," she said quietly. Abel stood, taking the shirt from her. His fingers brushed hers, lingering, intentional. "Thank you," he said. She hesitated, then stepped a little closer. "Abel, I need to tell you something." He straightened, concern flickering. "What is it?" She looked at her hands before lifting her eyes again. "When I ran across the desert, I thought I would die. When I came to your land, I said I needed a husband, because there was no other way to stay alive. But now I want to stay because of who you are, not because I'm afraid." Abel swallowed, emotion flashing through his guarded expression. "You don't owe me any promise," he said. "I'm not giving you a promise," she whispered. "I'm telling you the truth." He rose slowly, giving her room to change her mind. She didn't move back. She stepped closer to him instead. She stepped close enough that the warmth of the fire softened everything between them. "There's something else," she whispered. "Something I never expected." Abel watched the way her breath trembled, the way her fingers tightened against her skirt. "What is it, Nita?" She pressed a hand gently over her lower belly. Her touch was cautious, almost unsure. "I'm with child," she said, barely louder than the fire's crackle. His breath left him in one long, steady release. The flames flickered, as if the cabin itself had heard her. "Mine?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I felt it 2 days ago. I didn't say anything until I knew for certain." Abel didn't speak right away. He stepped forward instead, laying his hand over hers, his palm warm, steady, anchoring. "Nita," he murmured, "you're carrying our child." Her eyes shone, not from fear but tenderness, fragile and fierce at the same time. "Will you want me now?" she asked. "With danger behind me, with everything broken before?" Abel slid both hands around her waist, grounding her in a way she'd never been held. "I wanted you before," he said, "and I want you now. Stay with me, not because you need a husband, because this is your home." Her breath shook, a soft, trembling yes hidden beneath the rise of her chest. He didn't kiss her instantly. He lifted her chin first, searching her expression, making sure she wanted the closeness as much as he did. When she leaned into his touch, he bent and brushed his lips against hers, slow, warm, patient, like something long overdue and finally earned. Nita's hands rose to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his shirt. The kiss deepened only slightly, careful, reverent, a beginning rather than an end. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, breaths mingling softly. A knock sounded at the door, firm but not frantic. Abel stiffened instantly. Nita stepped back, fear rising, but Abel placed a calming hand on her arm before she could say a word. He opened the door with his rifle within reach, though not raised. Toby Graves, the courier from town, stood on the porch holding a sealed letter. "Message for Abel Harkin," he said. Abel took it. "Who's it from?" "Sheriff Clyde Barker," Toby answered. "Says a group of men were caught in the foothills. Said they were chasing someone. Claimed the woman belonged to them." Nita's breath hitched. Toby continued. "Sheriff Barker has Dutch Slade, Roe Carter, and Dusty Maris in custody. They won't be bothering anyone again." Abel nodded. "Thank you." When Toby rode off, Abel closed the door softly and turned to Nita. The wild fear in her eyes faded into something stunned and weightless. "It's over," he said quietly. "They're not coming." Her knees nearly gave out. Abel caught her gently, hand steady around her arms. "You're safe," he murmured. For the first time since her story began, she believed it. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, not out of duty, but belonging. The fire warmed the room as they stood there, the world outside finally still. Abel lifted her chin again, meeting her eyes. "There's something I want too," he said. She blinked up at him. "What is it?" His voice was steady as any promise he'd ever spoken. "Marry me, Nita. Not because you once asked out of fear, because I choose you." A quiet, joyful sob escaped her. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." They wed at sunrise the next morning, standing beside the hearth with nothing but the warm embers and the soft wind as their witnesses. No preacher, no papers, just two hands clasped tight, two voices speaking vows that mattered only to each other. Abel laid his palm over her stomach when their vows were done. "Welcome home," he said. Nita covered his hand with hers. "We stay together," she whispered. "Always." The fire glowed behind them. The ridge lay silent. And beneath the Arizona sky, they began a life built on warmth, trust, and the child growing beneath her heart. A family, one that stayed.